This is exactly how a front-wheel drive car should handle on roads like this. It's absolutely brilliant. That's right, the car I'm driving is an MG. Now, which MG is it? Well, some of you might recognise it from the dashboard already, but this is an MG ZS 180, which is effectively based on the old Rover 45 with a 2.5 litre 180 horsepower V6 in it and a nice big spoiler on the back. Now, if you're wondering why have I said that I think this might be the greatest performance bargain the UK's got, well, it's not because of that power figure. 180 horsepower isn't exactly a huge amount nowadays. It's more the fact that it's a decent amount of power and it's in a car which handles absolutely beautifully on country roads, and more to the point, this car cost me the grand total of £300. That's less than it cost me to tax it. So what is the MG ZS? Well, this is where it needs a little bit of a history lesson. Originally, Rover did do a car called the 400, but the 400 that most people recognise is the R8 Series 400, which started in 1989, and that was based on the old Honda Concerto. Now that car, the Concerto, was replaced by the Honda Domani, and in the mid-1990s, I think it's about 1995, they used that as the basis for the Rover 400. And the Rover 400 would later, with a facelift, become the Rover 45, and then in 2001 they built a performance variant bringing back the MG badge to create a quick version of all their cars. So there's a quick version of the 25 called the ZR, there's a quick version of the 75 called the ZT, and there's a quick version of the 45 which is this, the ZS. While at the time MG was still producing the F, which would shortly after be redeveloped into the TF, the reintroduction of the MG badge for performance models of existing cars marked a return to an approach that had been used for decades, starting with the very first MGs in the 1920s being based on Morris Oxfords, and the Z model designations hark back to the ZA and ZB magnets of the 1950s. Prior to this, the last time an MG badge was put on a pre-existing model was with the MGM cars, the Metro, Maestro and Montego, and while it seems like there's a big separation between the 80s cars and the 2000s, in fact the end of production of the M cars in 1991 only predates the Z cars by 10 years. However, it was a short-lived reintroduction for the MG badge because this lasted only from the formation of MG Rover post BMW ownership until that company went into receivership in 2005, with the MG name and assets being sold to Chinese company Nanjing Automotive. So, what's the differences? Well, the main obvious difference is it gets a big old body kit on it. So, you know, deep side skirts, mesh front grille, rather oversized spoiler on the back of it, considering the performance. I've actually had people mistake it for a Subaru when they've been talking to me about it and they've only seen the back of the car. But the big one is it got the 2.5 litre version of the V6. I believe you could get the 45 with the 2 litre, but the 2.5 only went into this. And that's 180 horsepower. That's slightly less power than the version that the ZT got. The ZT got 190 horsepower, thanks to it having a better intake system. But the main difference was that they had a bit of a fiddle with the suspension. The standard 45 twin wishbone front suspension and multi-link rear suspension was reworked. It's slightly lower, slightly different damping, and I think they changed the geometry slightly as well. And it certainly makes a big difference to how the car drives. It took the car from being a car that was perfectly serviceable but a bit stodgy, you know, the kind of thing which is the reason why people have the image of Rovers as being, you know, tweed and flat caps and packets of Werther's originals all over the place, and turned it into something that quite possibly is one of the best handling front-wheel drive cars out there. I mean, coming from Honda, the suspension systems, a lot of people say, oh, the suspension's the same as that from the Integra, and that's not entirely true. It's not the same suspension as the Integra. It's the same design as the Integra, with a twin wishbone system up front on a strut and a multi-link at the back, but it's not actually Integra components. So I'm not going to turn around and say, oh yes, this is like being able to go out and buy a DC2 with a V6 in it for £300. You get the 17-inch alloys on the 180, which were optional on the 4-cylinder versions. You also, as the 180, gets bigger brakes. They're about 20mm bigger, front and rear, compared to the standard car. Okay, here we have the Rover KV6. This is a 2.5 litre all aluminium wet lined V6, 24 valves with dual cams on each bank, and it also uses a variable intake system. There's some solenoids here which open and close flaps in the inlet tracks to lengthen and shorten them to change the profile of the engine. So it's not like VTEC, where VTEC can adjust your cams. It's purely an adjustable intake system. And it does work, although they are quite well known for gumming up with oil and failing. Speaking of things which fail, they are also quite well known for having the thermostat housing, which is buried in between the V's. That is made of plastic and that likes to let go. And in fact that did let go on this engine. I had to replace it, so I'll be having a video on that. But broadly speaking, the engines are pretty solid. There's a couple of things people get wrong about these, where first of all some people think they're a Honda engine, which they're not. They're Rover's own design. They replaced a 2.7 litre Honda in the last of the line 800s, and although when you get to these 2000s cars the engines are pretty good, those ones in the late 800s didn't have the best reputation. They weren't terribly well put together and they did have a bit of a tendency to fail. The other thing people say about these is they're like the 4-cylinder K series, and that's not entirely true. They do use a lot of the same design elements in them, so the wet liner all aluminium construction and the way they have a ladder bridge for the main bearings, but fundamentally there aren't really any parts on these which are out of the 4-cylinder. So it's all uniquely made relative to that. They're not as bad for reliability. Now the interior really isn't that much to write home about. It is basically 90s Honda, and you can see I've added a dual-in stereo in the centre console there. We'll have a video on how I've done that, but the rest of it is all fairly familiar, generic plastic. They have added some leather in places with these seats, but other than that it's pretty much what you'd expect from 90s Japan. Although these door trims are not exactly high quality. You can see someone's tried to glue these before and they're already failing again. I will have to do something about that, but for the time being that's not really affecting anything. So, build quality. What sort of thing goes wrong with these? Well, there's a few common problems. They can corrode quite badly underneath. The heating and cooling system, it's not that bad, but the V6 suffers from a plastic thermostat housing, which I think it might be due to the heat cycling it gets, but the plastic gets brittle and then fails. And on top of that, what is also plastic is the housing for the clutch hydraulics is plastic at both ends, and it's a very, very common failure point that the clutch hydraulics will just go on you, and often the slave cylinder will just shatter and come off the gearbox mount. And this car, well, this car had all those problems, because of course you can't expect to go out and spend £300 on a car, and especially if you're getting something that's maybe more performance biased. If you buy something for £300, you know you're going to be buying someone else's problems. So little caveat there on what I got for my money, but I was expecting that. I pretty much knew what I was getting into, and for me it doesn't change the fact that these cars are extremely good value. I mean, even if you buy a good one that's, you know, had these problems fixed and been looked after, to be perfectly honest, I think you'd be looking at maybe £1,000 to £1,500, which is still not much money at all in comparison to the equivalent things. Like, if you compare that to, say, the equivalent Honda, that's got to be half the price, and it's not half the car. Well, I've kind of done this a bit backwards in that I'm showing you the car after I've done the work on it, but over the next few weeks I'll be putting up some videos covering a few of the jobs I've tackled getting the car sorted, and anything else that crops up in the meantime. So if you're interested in seeing some repair work and the odd modification, please subscribe and keep watching.